One whispered word made the Mafia boss crush a wine glass in his bare hand. For 11 months, this mysterious waitress served him in absolute silence. But when his spoiled fiancé humiliated her, the waitress dropped a 22-year-old secret. She spoke a name that was supposed to be buried in a burned file from 2006. Now, a deadly game of chess has started, and the woman with red wine bleeding down her blouse holds the combination to his father's darkest vault.
Let us examine this clinical scene together, you and I. We are looking at a classic powder keg of pathological behavior. Who do you think you are? The question freezes the lungs of 40 hardened criminals. Notice the motionless waitress, dark red wine dripping rhythmically from her chin. Across the table sits Charlotte Banks, displaying a severe narcissistic rupture by demanding the worker kneel. Beside her sits Adrian Vico, the syndicate boss, exhibiting profound emotional attachment as he lowers his glass. As an analyst, I see this pattern often. Never mistake a completely quiet room for a safe environment. It is usually just holding its breath. Before we dissect this further, tell me where you are watching from today, and subscribe. The lesson here is simple. True danger rarely announces itself. It waits in perfect silence until it is too late. It is fascinating to observe where you tune in from. Let us return to the psychological wreckage at the table. I said the lamb, Adrian. Charlotte uses a manufactured sweetness, a calculated tactic designed to slowly erode his mental defenses. For 23 minutes, she has worn a superficial smile, the exact mask she weaponizes to exert dominance. Yet under the lights, her fragile porcelain facade is rapidly degrading. When Adrian points out she actually ordered the duck, Charlotte experiences a total emotional dysregulation, snapping to ask if changing her mind breaks his underworld laws. This reveals a very stark truth about human psychology. When you relentlessly push against someone's boundaries, do not be shocked the day they permanently detach and simply stop caring. Adrian clinically starves her of a response. He simply raises his glass, taking a painfully slow draw of wine. He studies his future bride with the total flat effect of a man watching a storm destroy an empty house. At 37, the chronic trauma of the syndicate has aged him prematurely. 8 years prior, his father was executed in this exact booth. From that traumatic incident, Adrian inherited a criminal empire and a permanent state of hypervigilance. He also inherited this toxic arrangement, a marriage contract signed entirely to ease his mother's dying breaths. He is a psychological prisoner of his own familial devotion. This serves as a vital warning for all of us. Loyalty is an essential human trait, but when it is given blindly without boundaries, that same loyalty will pull you deep underwater. Adrian sacrificed his autonomy for his mother's comfort, tethering himself to a profoundly toxic partner. Adrian, Charlotte snaps, her voice fracturing. He exhales, displaying complete emotional exhaustion. He confesses he has endured her chronic complaints for 4 years and can no longer filter the noise. She aggressively presents her massive ring, a sterile transaction managed by his staff because his emotional investment is zero. She screams that her politician father, Adrian, absorbs the verbal assault with pure, detached calm, nodding in casual agreement. His refusal to provide the reaction she craves only accelerates her spiral. There is profound behavioral wisdom in his radical indifference. Engaging with pure irrationality only validates it. Sometimes you must simply let the fire consume itself. Observe the environment with me. 2 tables away, a scarred enforcer breaks eye contact, using avoidance behavior to manage the severe discomfort. The veteran staff recognizes the clinical indicators of Charlotte's escalating crisis. They track her rising cruelty like analysts predicting a systemic collapse. Stage 2 is active. and stage 3 will inevitably require a victim. Out of this suffocating psychological tension, a lone waitress materializes. She exhibits zero signs of distress, completely immune to the toxic radiation pouring from the bride. In a perfectly modulated tone, she asks if they require anything else. It is a prime example of emotional regulation amidst severe chaos. We often forget this practical life lesson. Real power never needs to raise its voice. It stands perfectly still while fragile egos shatter completely. Charlotte narrows her eyes, attempting to cognitively process the waitress's faint accent. She is an aristocrat who assesses human value through rigid social markers. But this quiet woman presents a blank slate. To a controlling personality, any variable that cannot be categorized is a critical threat. Charlotte snaps, demanding the lamb. The waitress calmly states the kitchen is closed, showing no baseline shift in anxiety. Charlotte sneers, asking if she requested a speech. The response is a flat professional negative. Charlotte leans in close, deploying intimidation tactics to force a nervous response. Yet the waitress, with unblinking green eyes, refuses to adopt the victim role. Her clinical regulation teaches us an essential truth. When a deeply toxic individual tries to pull you into their private misery, your most devastating defense is unshakable peace. Stick with me here, you and I, because this is where the behavioral analysis becomes truly fascinating. The waitress remains motionless, holding a steady posture. Charlotte hisses an order to leave, but the girl exhibits absolute resilience. Regarding the lamb, experiencing a total ego collapse, Charlotte aggressively demands her. "Name Maeve," she replies, her vocal cords completely relaxed. Charlotte weaponizes the single name, mocking her lack of status, desperately seeking Adrian's validation. Adrian completely denies her the psychological supply she craves. He stares at the table and flatly instructs her to eat her duck. That calculated dose of total indifference acts as a catalyst. The hardest trigger for a deeply insecure person to process is an audience that refuses to react. Stay firmly grounded, and they will destroy themselves. We all carry psychological trauma, but Charlotte projects hers outward as a weapon. She has spent her life curating a mental archive of perceived slights, a coping mechanism for her severe feelings of inadequacy. That unaddressed neurosis governs her entirely. Tonight, facing a hollow syndicate marriage in exactly 6 weeks, sitting opposite a partner who displays unfiltered disgust, her brain frantically requires a scapegoat. She locks her erratic gaze on Maeve, loudly declaring she no longer desires the food. Clinically speaking, this is a textbook manifestation of displaced aggression. The fundamental lesson is critical for our own mental health. Unresolved internal conflicts will systematically infect your environment. If you refuse to process your own deep pain, you will inevitably harm the innocent bystanders who never even held the knife. Charlotte physically shoves the plate away, exhibiting a complete loss of impulse control. She declares her true objective is simply to witness Maeve beg. Maeve maintains an unwavering vocal frequency, clinically asking what exactly requires an apology. The profound rationality of this question pushes Charlotte toward a total mental break. For one micro-expression, the waitress shifts her pale eyes toward Adrian. The syndicate boss remains in a state of deep dissociation, staring into his glass, intentionally blocking out the psychological violence. Maeve offers a calculated, professional apology, but Charlotte is desperate to establish absolute dominance. She commands the worker to kneel. The collective anxiety in the room peaks. We must remember this truth. Forcing another human being into submission will never repair the structural damage of your own broken mind. Let us shift our clinical focus to the periphery for a moment, you and I. An aging syndicate leader completely ignores the dysregulated woman. His psychopathic gaze is fixed entirely on Adrian, conducting a silent threat assessment of how the young heir manages this escalating crisis. Back in the epicenter, Maeve keeps her hands laced in a controlled gesture. With a perfectly steady voice, she informs Charlotte she will not submit to the demand. Charlotte begins to experience severe physiological tremors, screeching about hierarchy. Maeve anchors her stance and delivers a chillingly rational refusal. Then the tension entirely snaps. A heavy crystal glass is suddenly airborne as all impulse control vanishes. True respect is never acquired through aggressive tantrums. It is forged by maintaining profound composure when the environment shatters completely around you. Charlotte is now operating purely from her primitive brainstem, her motor functions bypassing all logical restraint. She hurls her heavy crystal goblet directly at the server's face. The physical trauma is immediate. Crystal explodes against Maeve's cheekbone, sending sharp fragments across the floor. Dark wine mimics a catastrophic arterial bleed down her crisp collar. Yet, from a behavioral standpoint, this is the exact moment the dominance hierarchy violently flips. Maeve does not exhibit a normal startle response. She does not instinctively clutch her facial lacerations. She simply stands there, projecting a psychological void so deep that the seasoned sociopaths in the room physically recoil. The most terrifying and effective countermeasure to blind, unchecked aggression will always be absolute, unbreakable silence. Let us examine this behavioral shift together, you and I. In a fraction of a second, the meek illusion of Maeve completely dissolves. Her micro-expressions harden into a lifeless predatory glare. Presenting a classic sociopathic mask, the syndicate enforcers immediately recognize. By the bar, a massive guard quietly powers off his phone, his nervous system sensing the sudden threat. Trembling, Charlotte exhibits severe cognitive dissonance, foolishly demanding the bleeding girl grovel. Maeve denies her. When Charlotte threatens her, Maeve finally speaks, her voice utterly devoid of human empathy. "Who do you think you are?" The clinical takeaway is simple. Never assume the quietest individual in the room isn't harboring the most lethal psychological pathology. Observe the precise moment the psychological dominance transfers. Maeve locks her deadened eyes onto the spoiled heiress, clinically stripping away her unearned authority. The dim lighting catches the rising panic in Charlotte's face as she stammers, desperately clinging to her impending Mafia marriage as a defense mechanism. Maeve operates on a completely different frequency of trauma. She verbally dismantles the girl, exposing the fragile ego of a woman who throws tantrums like an under-socialized child. Maeve understands the dark political ties, yet delivers a freezing reality check that paralyzes the room. Here is a profound clinical truth. Wealth cannot cure a severe character defect, nor can it protect you from a subject who is entirely detached from the natural fear of death. Charlotte stands paralyzed, her trembling hands displaying acute autonomic arousal. The terrifying reality he finally penetrates her psychological denial. She just crossed a fatal boundary inside a room occupied by antisocial predators. This specific trauma will trigger nocturnal panic attacks for decades. Desperate, she begs Adrian to punish the waitress. But the crime boss, exhibiting classic megalomaniacal narcissism, simply tilts his head with a microscopic smirk. Lacking any genuine empathy, he informs his fiancée that Maeve works for the restaurant and the restaurant works for Charlotte. He washes his hands of her entirely, is stepping back. The behavioral lesson here is quite cold. Never assume a malignant narcissist will catch you when your own grandiosity pushes you over the edge. Let us step outside with them, you and I, where the tension perfectly mirrors their internal state. Adrian strides away, completely ignoring an older associate attempting a rare moment of paternal warmth. The boss has already compartmentalized and erased his trembling fiancée from his working memory. Nemtu, flattened him October wind.
No.
His flattened affect renders him numb to the cold. He issues a deadly command to Luca, demanding to uncover his dead father's hidden secrets. Standing by the car, Luca offers a heavy stare, knowing this investigation will psychologically fracture their syndicate. The clinical reality we find here is deeply tragic. Repressed familial trauma cannot remain buried forever. It will inevitably claw its way back to the conscious surface, demanding a final resolution. Adrian slides into the dark back seat, securing himself within a psychological vault. He mutters that Maeve is in Greenpoint. Luca is already 10 steps ahead, exhibiting classic hypervigilance by having Marco shadow her. For exactly 4 seconds, we observe a rare clinical anomaly. Adrian closes his eyes, allowing himself a microscopic window to process the crushing emotional weight of betrayal. Then, his dark defense mechanisms fully engage. His eyes snap open, cold and empty, demanding every data point on the name Cassian Voss. A heavy silence floods the car, broken only by distant sirens. This behavioral pattern illustrates a fragile human reality. We construct massive psychological walls to survive our trauma, but that absolute control is merely a dangerous, temporary illusion. The tension shatters when Luca quietly reveals that Cassian Voss has been deceased since 2004. Adrian reacts with immediate cognitive clarity. His father destroyed those specific syndicate files 2 years later to bury a deeply repressed psychological ghost. When Luca asks what the waitress actually said, Adrian confesses it was merely a single name. However, her delivery was pathologically calculated and precise. She displayed no physiological arousal when Adrian's terrifying megalomaniacal mask slipped. She has remained in a state of dormant predatory waiting, preparing for this exact strike. This case file teaches a terrifying but scientifically sound lesson. Patience born from deep, unhealed emotional trauma is the most dangerous psychological weapon a human mind can forge. Idling at a red light, Luca exhibits severe somatic tension, gripping the wheel until his knuckles turn white. Due to his conditioned dependency, he refuses to meet his boss in the mirror. He states the logical variables. If Cassian is alive and Maeve shares his genetics, the former leader fabricated a massive deception to conceal an unforgivable transgression. Adrian coldly states he understands this blood debt, fully intending to eradicate it. The light turns green and Luca accelerates. Miles away, we observe Maeve, experiencing acute post-traumatic shaking on the edge of her bathtub, a damp rag pressed to her face. She is terrified of the psychological storm she just summoned. We can run from our behavioral conditioning, but our unresolved history will always track us down. Let us analyze this clinical isolation together. You and I, Maeve, sit in her dark bathroom at 11:10. Fascinatingly, her amygdala is not reacting to the armed enforcers who nearly killed her. Instead, her cognitive focus is firmly anchored to the auditory memory of Adrian, crushing a glass barehanded, analyzing his microscopic emotional shutdown. For 11 months, she profiled this narcissistic leader from the shadows. She mapped his routines and convinced herself she understood his pathology entirely. The profound psychological lesson hidden in her shock is one we frequently ignore. When you spend all your time analyzing a sociopathic subject, it is incredibly easy to forget they still possess an unpredictable, deeply flawed human neuroanatomy. For nearly a year, Maeve conducted a behavioral study, on how he commanded his enforcers while emotionally starving his fiancée. She diagnosed him as a man entirely locked inside his own narcissistic prison. She had cognitively prepared herself for a violent outburst when dropping her grandfather's name. Yet, she lacked the clinical distance to process the raw vulnerability that washed over his eyes in that split second. Life enforces this harsh psychiatric truth. We can spend years constructing intellectual armor for conflict, but we are rarely prepared to witness a subject's unfiltered psychological brokenness. Suddenly, the quiet is shattered by her buzzing phone. An unknown caller claims to be a friend of her grandfather, instantly triggering a massive adrenaline spike. Acute panic sets in instantly. Maeve darts to the window, her hyper-aroused visual cortex. She perceives only a taxi and a solitary shadow. She demands identification, but the voice interrupts her frantic questioning. He insists his identity is irrelevant, warning her that dropping that name awakened deeply buried psychological ghosts. The older predators are panicking, exhibiting a sociopathic ruthlessness even a megalomaniac like Adrian cannot contain. The stranger asks if Adrian processed the name clearly. Upon confirmation, he delivers a chilling clinical verdict. The psychological point of no return is crossed. Here is a brutal truth. Once you intentionally ignite the repressed trauma of a criminal family, you simply cannot undo the violent behavioral chaos that immediately follows. Maeve attempts to project a false ego strength, refusing blind directives from an unidentified subject. However, the stranger's effect softens. He explains her grandfather called him Felix, a dissociative alias to replace a violent past. Felix confesses to a deeply ingrained moral vow. If Maeve ever triggered this systemic crisis, he would intervene. He admits searching for her for 2 years, only to discover her dangerous proximity to the syndicate. He pleads with her to utilize their shrinking window of darkness. This proves that conditioned human devotion can survive long past the grave. Exhausted, her adrenaline crashing, she slumps against the porcelain and requests a behavioral protocol. Felix quietly instructs her that her only objective tonight is baseline biological survival. Felix calmly dictates an acute stress survival protocol. He orders her to evacuate before sunrise and relocate without verbalizing her intentions. Then, he introduces a crucial diagnostic warning regarding Adrian. He cautions that while the young megalomaniac is not her active predator, he is completely devoid of genuine altruism. You and I can easily recognize this agonizing psychological gray area, where calculating a subject's true intent becomes impossible. For a targeted individual, that gray area is a lethal cognitive trap. Felix transmits safehouse coordinates, commanding her to commit the numerical data to memory and destroy the digital evidence. We watch as she stares at the glowing screen in the dark, carving the exact escape route deep into her exhausted neural pathways. Let us open this case file together and examine the subject, Maeve. We observe a classic acute stress response. Her hands tremble as she deletes the message, questioning the psychological labyrinth her grandfather left behind. Exactly 40 seconds elapse before the device vibrates again. A blocked number appears with no text, just a digital ghost that vanishes instantly. Her autonomic nervous system takes over. She cognitively processes that an unmapped predator is hunting her. Distinct from Felix, her survival mechanism engages and she extinguishes the lights. Outside, Adrian remains catatonic in his black sedan, fixated on her darkened window. This behavioral mirror presents a simple, profound truth. We do not genuinely fear the absence of light. We fear the breathing, unresolved traumas concealed within it. We must clinically dissect the environment inside this freezing car. Observe Luca's rigid posture. We see a profound trauma bond where true devotion demands burying his own natural curiosity alive. In the rear seat, Adrian exhibits severe bruxism, his jaw clenched as he processes Maeve's tactical precision. She spent 11 months moving through his territory, undetected. Luca rationalizes her evasion tactics as clinical paranoia, but Adrian recognizes the calculated behavior of a survivor. When Luca questions what Cassian Voss meant to the former patriarch, Adrian merely stares at the amber glow of her window. The psychological takeaway here is deeply grounding for anyone. You cannot compartmentalize the ghosts of your past forever. Eventually, suppressed memories will breach the surface and demand your full, undivided attention. The focus shifts to the solitary light in Maeve's window, a beacon of unresolved trauma. Adrian mentally dissects the pathology of his father, a textbook megalomaniac narcissist who survived through absolute isolation. He formed no attachments. The lesson embedded here is brutally functional. Allowing emotional proximity simply hands an adversary a loaded weapon, and true survival often requires severe emotional blunting. Yet, Cassian Voss represented a critical structural failure in his father's defenses. Adrian's vocal constriction reveals deep distress as he admits he first heard that name on the day the patriarch died, discovering a secured drawer. When Luca probes for the contents, Adrian confesses a profound sense of learned helplessness. He had desperately craved the hidden truth, yet remained completely paralyzed before that rusted iron lock. Visualize the fading patriarch, in his final moments, imparting a final cognitive anchor to his son. He articulated that certain psychological burdens must be deferred until the psyche is equipped to endure them. It is an undeniable truth. We cannot force revelations before our minds possess the resilience to bear the heavy weight. 2 hours later, the narcissist expired, leaving the box sealed for 8 years. Adrian exhibits classic cognitive dissonance, admitting he rationalized the mystery as the delusions of a dying man. Abruptly, the amber light above extinguishes. Total sensory deprivation sets in. In that dark void, a sudden paradigm shift strikes Adrian's consciousness. The lockbox was never devoid of meaning. He deduces that Maeve is the biological key, having engineered a complex behavioral script to culminate in this exact moment. Stick with me as we unpack the clinical psychology of this moment. As the vehicle departs, Adrian engages in rapid threat assessment, decoding her motives. Why would a subject who maintained perfect camouflage for 11 months deploy a trigger word capable of destabilizing his hierarchy just weeks before a strategic union? We observe a retrospective of Maeve, stained with wine, trapped in temporary motor paralysis. We all understand how severe panic overrides rational thought. She lacked any intent to reveal her objective tonight. The chaotic variable of the thrown glass fractured her constructed persona. The forbidden name bypassed her cognitive filters during an adrenaline spike. It proves an essential life lesson. Even the most rigidly structured systems and careful plans can completely collapse from a single unpredictable external stimulus. The visual field narrows on Luca, his knuckles blanched against the steering wheel from extreme tension. He verbalizes that Charlotte perpetually acts as a catalyst for disorder. Adrian then initiates a radical behavioral shift, terminating the strategic marital alliance with zero vocal fluctuation. His flat affect reveals a critical psychological boundary and a timeless lesson. You cannot chronically suppress your own needs to satisfy the expectations of others. Such compliance will inevitably cause total psychic bankruptcy. Luca predicts severe retaliation from Senator Banks over this broken promise. Yet Adrian maintains perfect physical stillness, embodying absolute emotional detachment. He calmly hypothesizes that the senator is about to encounter trauma far exceeding a nullified contract. The union was merely a maladaptive coping mechanism. Retreating into the vehicle's interior, Adrian adopts the cognitive posture of a hyper-vigilant strategist. His ocular movements indicate deep internal processing. He commands Luca to conduct a forensic excavation of their historical archives, requiring every encrypted file connected to Cassian 4, prior to 2004, the regional tax ledgers, and the incinerator logs. Most urgently, he seeks the profile of the individual who successfully deceived his narcissistic father regarding the Boston fire. The fundamental lesson remains absolute. A stable future cannot exist upon a rotting foundation of systemic deception. When Luca inquires about handling the subject upstairs, Adrian instructs him to allow her to rest. He observes her window receding, clinically aware that her compulsion for retribution was cultivated in deeply toxic developmental soil. Adrian vocalizes his intent into the frigid air, displaying a trace of grief as he resolves to administer the traumatic disclosure personally. The perspective shifts 3 levels up. Maeve exhibits rigid immobility in her unlit residence, using tactile grounding against the cold plaster as the engine dissipates. She engages in controlled diaphragmatic breathing, demonstrating the conditioned response of a chronic survivor. Her environmental awareness registered two distinct automotive signatures. One manifested briefly before retreating, while the other established a static observation post. This duality enforces a harsh life lesson. We are rarely monitored by a single entity in a hostile environment. She processes a prior warning about antisocial personalities so devoid of empathy that even Adrian would fail to contain their incoming storm of violence. Let us unpack the cognitive schema driving her behavior together. The focus narrows as Maeve accesses a deeply encoded memory of her grandfather. His conditioning dictated that authentic allegiance is quantified by sustained silence, not verbal declarations. Visually, a homicidal threat and a dedicated guardian cast an identical shadow. However, an aggressive psychopath exhibits micro-tremors of arousal, whereas a protector maintains absolute physiological stillness. This provides an invaluable life lesson. Always evaluate an individual by the quality and discipline of their patience. That dark sedan beneath the street lamp demonstrated precisely that level of regulated immobility. Breaking her hold on the wall, she navigates into the kitchen. She registers an absence of fear, experiencing only the heavy cognitive load of the generational violence she has catalyzed. Maeve executes her behavioral script with rigid adherence to her internalized survival heuristics, treating them as absolute dogma. The situational irony is a fascinating study in proximity. The secured compartment that anchored Adrian's obsessive focus resides merely 8 blocks away. Yet she possesses the cognitive key. That numeric sequence has been locked in her long-term memory since early adolescence. This dynamic reinforces a stark life lesson. The most devastating tactical advantage is the ability to delay gratification and know precisely when to strike. Immersed in darkness, she engages in a moral calculus regarding whether Adrian possesses the emotional threshold to process his father's sociopathy. She defers this diagnosis to daylight. Below, a subordinate operative clutches a thermos, strictly tasked with unbroken surveillance of her entry point until the morning. Analyze this escalating stress response with me. At 12:37, Marco's mobile device provides a sudden visual stimulus in the dark cabin. An encrypted transmission arrives, inducing an immediate spike in his cortisol levels. The text simply states she is aware of his presence. We observe the acute panic in his facial musculature as his cognitive map inverts. The designated target has maintained superior situational awareness all along. This underscores a critical life lesson in human behavior. You must never underestimate the individuals who maintain strictly verbal silence, experiencing temporary paralysis. Marco initiating an urgent unlit structure before initiating an urgent communication to Luca. Shortly after, the phone rings in Adrian's study. The air is fully stimulated, hyper-focusing on his father's illicit financial data, bracing for an inevitable psychological blow. The linguistic payload reverberates through Adrian's working memory, followed by a brief auditory vacuum. He questions if Maeve initiated the contact, but Luca admits a total lack of empirical data. The untraceable node self-destructed upon Marco's reciprocal dial. While Maeve is a statistical probability, the secondary hypothesis induces severe paranoia. Is an unidentified tertiary entity conducting meta-surveillance upon their operatives. This reveals a fundamental life lesson regarding social hierarchies. Irrespective of your accumulated dominance, a more sophisticated apex predator is perpetually operating beyond your visual range. A profound autonomic chill registers in Adrian's physiology. The presence of a competing faction indicates an impending structural collapse. Processing the lack of reinforcements, Adrian immediately dispatches a secondary unit, enforcing an absolute quarantine on the perimeter. Let us examine Adrian's immediate trauma response. He compulsively orders his man to photograph the text, wipe the file, and destroy the device. Isolated in his study, a profound paralysis sets in. He stares at the towering archives of syndicate history. He locates exactly 3 references to Cassian Voss. Yet, someone had taken a razor to the paper, surgically excising the name and leaving behind violent empty voids. Adrian recognizes the pathology immediately. It was his father's handiwork. In clinical practice, we see a simple truth emerge time and again. You cannot cure a psychological wound by merely cutting out the parts you refuse to look at. The silence left behind always demands the most attention. His father attempted to murder a legacy, but suppressed trauma inevitably breaches the surface, bleeding into the present. Notice the somatic markers of severe anxiety, a distinct tremor in Adrian's fingers as they grip a cold ceramic mug. He drops it onto the desk, the dull thud, mirroring the profound dissociation hollowing his chest. His father was a violent man, megalomaniac, whose only tether to humanity was his son. But in clinical terms, that kind of love is highly toxic. Consider the night Adrian turned 18. He returned home trembling, his hands coated in another man's blood. His father sat in this exact chair, entirely desensitized to the horror, and whispered that Adrian was the only pure thing he ever created. He weaponized affection, implanting a seed of survivor's guilt deep in the boy's psyche. It is a harsh reality of human attachment. Sometimes the individuals who claim to love us the most are the ones who inflict the most permanent psychological damage. We must carefully unpack the paradox of that memory. Adrian knew his father was not offering comfort, but rather projecting his own monstrous reflection, practically begging his son to reject the very violence he modeled. Yet this same father maintained a fabricated narrative about a Boston fire, compartmentalizing his guilt. Returning to the present, Adrian's paranoia is entirely justified. 4 armed guards monitor his perimeter, watching the one woman holding the key to his cognitive dissonance. Running out of options, he dials his Aunt Rosa. She is 68, a woman who adapted to her violent environment through sheer cold-blooded resilience. In behavioral analysis, we learn a very simple lesson. The suppressed truths we spend our entire lives running away from are precisely the destructive forces that will eventually tear our reality apart. Today, you and I are going to examine the psychology of survival in a highly predatory environment. Aunt Rosa did not outlive the sociopaths around her by matching their physical aggression. She employed adaptive camouflage, functioning as the apex predator while hiding behind the harmless persona of an elderly grandmother. She supposedly terminated her involvement 8 years ago, retreating to a quiet brownstone to cultivate a mundane existence. But the moment Adrian breaches protocol and speaks the name Cassian Voss, the repressed hostility is triggered. The line goes entirely dead. For Rosa, silence is a calculated tactic, heavy with unresolved pathology. It serves as a classic psychological reminder. No matter how meticulously you construct a peaceful new identity, the unresolved traumas of your past will always track you down. Rosa has always utilized silence as a mechanism of absolute control. The line remains dead for 8 excruciating seconds, and we observe Adrian's escalating panic. He realizes he has triggered a severely repressed psychological landmine. Finally, she demands to know where he heard that name. Adrian's voice betrays his regression to a childlike state of fear as he describes the strange woman. Green eyes, dark hair, roughly 30 years of age. In a fraction of a second, Rosa's carefully constructed cognitive defenses disintegrate. She does not scream. Instead, her tone drops into a clinical, lethal register, commanding him to stop speaking on an unsecure channel. This reaction perfectly illustrates a dangerous human flaw. The blind spots we stubbornly refuse to examine are exactly what can dismantle our carefully ordered lives in an instant. You and I have likely experienced the visceral, biological shock of a late-night phone call that instantly shifts the nervous system into a state of panic. Rosa commands Adrian to arrive before dawn, explicitly isolating him by ordering him to leave his trusted subordinate, Luca, behind. She implies this systemic infection predates his birth. For the first time, Adrian detects genuine, unmasked terror in the matriarch's voice. He asks if she is physically safe, but his own defense mechanisms are failing. The 4 massive guards outside his window no longer provide an illusion of security. Paranoia has fully taken root. It is a textbook case of generational trauma. We inevitably find ourselves paying the absolute highest emotional prices for the terrible, destructive decisions our parents foolishly believed they had successfully buried. Her final words hang in the room, a psychological toxin slowly poisoning the air. Rosa explains this unknown woman possesses highly volatile data that threatens the family's entire structure. Adrian clinically agrees, accepting that while the threat is contained tonight, his reality will fracture by morning. Then, Rosa delivers a fatal blow to his ego. She reveals his father harbored a deeper emotional attachment to this Cassian figure than to his own biological son. In this twisted family dynamic, loyalty extracts a devastating toll, one that clearly fractured his father's mental state. Adrian terminates the call. He stares up at the ceiling, utterly dissociated before returning to his morbid archival research. We must always remember that the heaviest emotional burdens we carry through this life are almost always suffered in complete silence. Let us shift our clinical focus across the city, observing Maeve as her circadian rhythm abruptly snaps her awake at 5:14. She exhibits the symptoms of severe, conditioned hypervigilance. Remaining entirely motionless in the dark, she analyzes the acoustic environment exactly as her grandfather programmed her to do. She differentiates between the baseline quiet of a dormant city and the suppressed, heavy silence of a nearby threat. Operating with mechanical detachment, she dresses in functional, dark clothing. She secures a prepared bag containing untraceable currency and communication devices. She has spent months living in a state of anticipatory trauma. True survival behavior is rarely about the sudden explosion of conflict. It is deeply rooted in the obsessive disciplined preparation maintained when absolutely no one is observing. When absolutely no one is observing you. Pay close attention because you and I are about to watch a textbook trauma response unfold. Her motor control is steady as she places two highly loaded psychological anchors into her bag. One is a heavy key to an unknown lock. The other is a weathered letter she has actively avoided reading for 2 years, a classic manifestation of denial. Glancing out the window, her paranoid ideation is validated. A fourth vehicle joins the surveillance perimeter. Yet, her facial affect remains completely blunted. She moves to the kitchen, engaging in the grounding ritual of brewing strong coffee. As the caffeine stimulates her nervous system, she evaluates her agonizing options. Does she trust the informant or march directly into the pathology of the syndicate prince? In life, our greatest struggle is rarely deciding whether to act, but choosing which fire to step into. The harsh artificial light exposes the chronic sleep deprivation, degrading her system. She knows her primary contact, Felix, suffers from divided loyalties, making him a high-risk variable. Her mind involuntarily regresses to a formative memory of her grandfather. She was only 12 when he began conditioning her with a brutal cognitive framework. He taught her that when the pressure mounts, the defensive response of hiding is a fatal error. Survival requires a calculated risk of trust. He explained that the Vico organization owed them an emotional and physical debt that simple currency could never resolve. Staring into her cup, the immense gravity of her conditioning weighs heavily upon her. Placing your trust in another human being is a terrifying risk, but eventually we are all forced to gamble our fragile safety in order to truly live. We observe Maeve initiating direct contact with the source of her trauma. She activates a secure device, typing a message to a memorized number, explicitly demanding a face-to-face meeting with the apex of the syndicate. Her demand for immediate confrontation is a classic attempt to regain agency. Exactly 17 seconds later, the screen illuminates. The rapid response confirms her worst paranoid suspicion. They are already watching. The Phantom agrees to meet at a public coffee shop at 8 o'clock. Before leaving, she reaches into the darkest corner of her kitchen drawer. It is a fundamental human defense mechanism to instinctively bury the physical artifact connected to our deepest pain. Yet, as any clinician will tell you, those are exactly the painful elements we must finally drag into the light if we ever hope to achieve genuine healing. Let us examine this artifact together. It acts as a perfect trigger for psychological decompensation. Inside rests a black and white photograph from 1987, capturing two men frozen in apparent camaraderie. Maeve recognizes one face intimately. An autonomic response occurs. A cold shiver traces her spine as she registers the jawline of the megalomaniacal narcissist she observes every Thursday. On the reverse, her grandfather penned a note calling it the last good summer. She stares at the ink, crushed by the cognitive dissonance of stolen time. Memory is a haunting mechanism, reminding us of a simple human truth. Time is an absolute thief, and we are entirely powerless to reclaim the fragile moments we let slip through our fingers. The behavioral pattern is textbook evasion. Maeve secures the envelope, bypassing the front door to descend a rusted fire escape into a blind alley. Her pursuers wait out front, oblivious their target has vanished. Across the city, Adrian pulls up to the Huron coffee shop at 7:52. He just fed his lieutenant, Luca. A calculated fabrication about visiting an aunt. Through the lens of Stockholm Syndrome, Luca blindly accepts this manipulation. Adrian understands his current trajectory is a deliberate descent into trauma. It highlights a tragic psychological mechanism. we often deploy. We construct masterful lies, convincing ourselves. Deception is the only way to protect those we love from the fallout of our own choices. The setting provides ideal isolation for confrontation. Sun bleeds through the frosted glass, casting bruised shadows. Adrian sits in the corner, enveloped by stale espresso and remorse. He arrived in an untraceable vehicle, a calculated effort to erase his footprint. When the clock strikes 8, Maeve steps into the frame. Our clinical observation focuses on her heavy duffel bag. Adrian experiences an acute spike in cortisol. He recognizes she intended to vanish without him, shattering his illusion of control. This forces us to confront a devastating reality of the human condition. We frequently operate under the delusion that we are the primary protagonists of our world, only to discover we are simply collateral damage in another person's struggle for survival. Let us observe the subject's hypervigilance under stress. The lights frame Maeve as she calculates exit routes like a cornered predator. She locks eyes with the crime boss, displaying the flattened affect of someone stripped of attachments. Adrian leans forward, attempting to establish dominance. Tractor stating his operative. Tracked her since 5 in the morning. Maeve remains unresponsive, clinically noting her failure to secure the adjacent rooftop. Her apathy toward her own potential termination is a fascinating study in trauma response. It serves as a stark reminder for anyone building emotional walls. No matter how meticulously you construct your psychological defenses, it only takes one overlooked fracture to let total devastation slip inside. The environment maintains a fragile illusion of normalcy. Civilians consume beverages, blind to the psychological warfare at the corner table. Adrian adopts a rigid tone, acknowledging her undetectable movements across the rooftops. He deploys his primary weapon, whispering the truth about the hidden photograph. Maeve exhibits a severe physiological reaction. Her respiration halts and her muscles coil into a defensive posture. Adrian reveals his aunt unearthed the secret, an image from 1987 documenting a pathological alliance forged in violence. The exposure of this repressed trauma could dismantle their criminal organizations entirely. It is a sobering psychological absolute we must all face. The earth is never dense enough to keep our darkest transgressions buried forever. The psychological tension stretches to its limit. Adrian fixes his gaze upon her, asserting she brought the artifact to negotiate for her survival. Maeve's micro-expressions betrayed genuine shock regarding his aunt's discovery. Adrian, his dismantle, and her grandfather, revealing his father and her grandfather were not master and servant. They operated as equal partners in a sociopathic syndicate. This cognitive shock highlights a terrifying truth about human attachments. The individuals we trust most frequently operate behind masks we never think to question. Years ago, her grandfather uncovered compromising data on Senator Banks. That single act of espionage triggered an execution order, and now that radioactive secret is asphyxiating everyone in the room. You and I must analyze the trauma of this revelation. Adrian exhibits tremors as he confesses a pathological sacrifice. His father did not bury a friend. He orchestrated a fabricated death, constructing a phantom identity for the man's sound survival. Maeve's dissociative shield fractures. Perspiration traces her jaw, signaling extreme autonomic arousal. Her voice degrades to a whisper, asking about the final parameters of the arrangement. Adrian outlines a mutual destruction pact. If the politicians' toxic data ever surfaced, their families were programmed to self-destruct together. It teaches us a brutal lesson regarding interpersonal devotion. Authentic loyalty is rarely found in comfortable gestures. It is measured by the willingness to stand firm as the surrounding structure collapses into ash. The civilian environment contrasts sharply with this psychological warfare. A worker calls an order detached from the destructive ideation nearby. Maeve tilts her head, employing direct confrontation. She reminds Adrian his father is deceased, questioning his capacity to inherit such a megalonical role. An involuntary swallow betrays the hereditary burden of violence registering in his mind. He is entering an active conflict without comprehending the senator's pathology. In this subculture, a binding agreement functions as an absolute psychological trigger. It enforces a rigid behavioral code, reminding us that personal integrity demands a heavy toll. Honoring our commitments often requires a fortitude that supersedes our primal instinct for self-preservation. The dynamic shifts as Adrian initiates an offensive posture. He leans forward, his delivery designed to inflict maximum psychological distress. He dismantles her cover, noting her waitress job was merely an observational assignment. He then questions the public official to weaponize his own daughter as an espionage tool. Blood retracts from Maeve's face as she processes this extreme narcissistic abuse. The arranged marriage was a manipulative construct. It is a sickening illustration of human depravity. The most damaged individuals will readily sacrifice their own offspring to maintain absolute control over their environment. Adrian delivers the final psychological rupture. The corrupt politician was fully aware her grandfather remained alive this entire time. The clinical picture crystallizes into a horrifying pattern. Adrian realizes the senator has been methodically tracking Maeve's bloodline for 2 decades. Positioning Charlotte in Adrian's intimate space was a masterclass in sociopathic manipulation, neutralizing his threat detection. Maeve exhibits acute physical tension, knuckles whitening as repressed rage breaches her flat effect. This demonstrates a perilous reality of human interaction. The most lethal predators do not lurk in shadows. They sit across from you at dinner, mirroring your smile, while methodically engineering your destruction. Maeve's remaining psychological innocence terminates here. The elaborate engagement was devoid of emotional attachment. It was strictly a strategic targeting mechanism aimed directly at Adrian's beating heart. Pay close attention to this behavioral shift. Maeve's modulations remain steady as she outlines the politician's diagnostic test. He needed to verify if Adrian inherited the sociopathic traits of his predecessors. Adrian was programmed to bond with a hostile agent, marching into systematic termination. A mere auditory fragment about a deceased individual disrupted the operation. Observe Maeve's compromised motor control as she slides the envelope forward. It lands with the psychological weight of an explosive device. Her grandfather is 81, existing in isolation, yet his hippocampus functions as a secure repository for the forbidden data. The cruel mechanisms of this world validate a terrifying hypothesis. A disciplined, silent mind remains the most devastating weapon a human can possess. The subject's dissociative barriers suffer total failure. Maeve confesses she underwent systematic behavioral conditioning, deployed 2 years ago as a surveillance asset. But a violent event altered her trajectory, proving a trauma response, once initiated, cannot be reversed. She interrogates Adrian's psychological profile, demanding to know if he possesses his father's predatory drive. When Adrian shows a micro-expression of hesitation, she exploits the weakness. She clinically notes his father would have already processed the artifact. This highlights a critical vulnerability. The illusion of power dissipates. The millisecond indecision is displayed. Provoked by this assessment, Adrian's composure shatters. He tears the seal, exposing the visual record of their predecessors. Let us examine the psychological breaking point of our subject, Adrian. His hardened exterior dissolves completely as he traces a faded photograph, mourning the unburdened smile of a father he barely knew. Maeve observes this emotional hemorrhage with cold detachment. She notes this captured their final summer of innocence, before the violence began. Peace is a fragile sheet of glass, capable of shattering instantly. Yet, grief is a luxury they cannot afford. Maeve turns to stone as she delivers the final stimulus, and two reapers are parked out call, and two reapers are parked outside. Adrian realizes the predators are circling. We must remember this simple truth. The moments we feel the absolute safest are usually when the trap finally snaps shut. The paranoia in the room escalates. As a phantom enters our clinical narrative, Adrian demands to know how she identified the hitman, his voice cracking with pure panic. Maeve casually drops the name Felix, an unseen guardian operating from the darkest corners of their world. This phantom was the man who tipped off Adrian's enforcers the night before, pulling the strings to test the boy's mental resilience. By locking down the city block flawlessly, Adrian proved that the venom of a true kingpin runs in his veins. It is a textbook initiation rite for an emerging megalomaniac. The lesson here is grounded in human nature. Even when you feel entirely isolated in your suffering, someone is always watching from the shadows to see how you carry your burdens. Today, you and I are going to unpack this psychological collapse together. Maeve offers a haunting concession, stating the old phantom admitted Adrian outpaced his legendary father by 60 seconds. A dark, hollow laugh escapes Adrian's chest. For one intoxicating moment, the heavy crown of a megalomaniac settles upon his brow. But absolute pride always invites a catastrophic fall. His phone vibrates against the wood, delivering a message from Charlotte, the viper he almost married. Her father knows exactly where Maeve is. The shift from supreme confidence to primal terror is jarring. Adrian barks a desperate command to evacuate as Maeve fades toward the door. It teaches us a brutal reality. The Reaper always chooses to strike at the exact second you finally allow yourself to exhale. Red police lights slash across the wet asphalt, yet Maeve remains perfectly motionless. I recognize this immediately as the frozen apathy of generational trauma. Adrian studies the subtle tightening of her jaw, identifying the exact same emotional armor he was forced to forge as a child of the syndicate. He pulls her toward the idling sedan, his voice barely rising above the sirens as he delivers a fatal psychological blow. His former fiancée, Charlotte, just sold them to the wolves. Banks set this trap 20 minutes ago, demonstrating the ultimate manipulation of a seasoned sociopath. It leaves us with a painful truth about human survival. No matter how desperately you sprint into the dark, you can never outrun a predator who already owns the shadows. The dread settling over Maeve is a palpable, suffocating force. She understands the pathology of a predator like Banks, a man who only reveals his hand when the barrel is already resting against your skull. She searches Adrian for a rational answer, wondering why a fiercely loyal daughter would suddenly destroy her own family. Unlocking the car doors, Adrian reveals the dark anatomy of a broken heart. Last night, Banks sacrificed Charlotte, crushing her wedding, without a flicker of remorse. Now, the woman Adrian used to love is a serpent uncoiling in the dark, craving the total ruin of her father's criminal legacy. It serves as a stark reminder of human frailty. Blind loyalty is a trusted knife finds your back, but it shatters the second a trusted knife finds your back. Inside the dim cabin, Adrian processes the reality that Charlotte finally recognizes herself as a disposable pawn on a rotting chessboard. It is a massive psychological rupture. His knuckles turn white as he throws the sedan through rain-slicked streets to shake banks and his relentless pursuers. Beside him, the pale glow of a cheap phone illuminates Maeve's face as her thumbs move with frantic precision. Outwardly, she is carved from cold marble, suppressing every survival instinct. Yet, the rapid pulse at her throat betrays a silent, agonizing storm of terror underneath the surface. We must always remember this simple truth. The individuals who appear the most unbreakable on the outside are usually fighting the most devastating, unseen wars inside their own minds. Adrian coldly observes the agonizing mental toll it takes on Maeve to swallow her panic. He demands the exact location of her legendary grandfather. In response, Maeve lets out a harsh, broken laugh devoid of any warmth. For 22 brutal years, that old man has lived as a ghost, outsmarting both federal authorities and private armies. She grips her phone, refusing to gamble 2 decades of meticulous survival on the unpredictable rage of Adrian's scorned lover. She respects the ancient blood vows his father once made, but her psychological defenses will simply not allow her to trust Adrian yet. It teaches us a profound lesson. True trust is never a gift freely given to a stranger. It is a heavy currency, forged and earned only in the absolute darkest of human moments. Let us look at this together, shall we? The psychological tension inside this vehicle is absolutely brutal, staggering. Maeve has just delivered a brutal reality check, forcing Adrian to swallow his bruised, narcissistic pride. The tight lines of his face betray his inner turmoil as he murmurs an agreement. He grips the wheel, treating the sprawling city grid like a massive chessboard. He is channeling the raw survival instincts of his father, keeping the machine moving at all costs. Suddenly, a call from Luca shatters the silence. The vehicles riding their bumper belong to the corrupt senator, and 4 heavy guns are hunting them down. It illustrates a vital lesson. When the entire world is burning around you, relentless momentum is sometimes the only thing keeping you alive. The crisis escalates with a terrifying clinical speed. Through the harsh speakerphone, Luca's voice bleeds pure panic. He reveals that Danny Rohr, a merciless hitman on the senator's dirty payroll trail, is leading the pursuit. Worse, their men breached Maeve's apartment only to find a total void. Adrian's eyes a stunning locked forward as he delivers a stunning psychological shock. He coldly admits Maeve is sitting right beside him, having deliberately kept his oldest friend in the dark to test loyalty and shield him from the fallout. Then, Adrian issues a scorched earth directive to permanently cancel the extravagant Mafia wedding. It teaches us a very difficult truth. Sometimes, to survive the darkness, you must strike the match yourself and watch your former life burn entirely to ashes. The suffocating silence over the phone carries the weight of a collapsing empire. Luca warns that canceling the venue guarantees the vendors will talk, transforming this betrayal into a massive public spectacle. Adrian's face remains cast in shadow, completely devoid of empathy. He coldly whispers that the wedding died last night, and he is simply signing the death certificate. Watching him, Maeve instantly dissects his ruthless strategy. By forcing a public scandal, Adrian inflicts deep narcissistic injury upon Banks. Crucially, he gives the vengeful Charlotte the exact motivation she needs to leak syndicate secrets. It is a harsh reality of survival. Sometimes, you must burn your own house down to the foundations just to expose the rats hiding inside the walls. Adrian stares at the dashboard, calculating the venom Charlotte will unleash to dismantle her father's syndicate. He murmurs a chilling psychological truth, while fiery anger eventually burns out. The cold stain of public humiliation lasts a lifetime. He displays no joy in this dark mental chess. Yet Maeve watches him with clinical fascination. She admits she would always choose a man who owns his ruthless nature over a false hero pretending his hands are clean. Then Adrian unveils a vital trigger point. His aunt finally confessed about the hidden document Maeve's grandfather unearthed decades ago, buried solely to shield Adrian's father from the crossfire. It is a deeply tragic irony. The heavy secrets we bury to protect the people we love are often the exact things that destroy them. Stick with me, because this is where the pathology of power truly reveals itself. Idling under a harsh traffic light, Adrian exposes the terrifying nature of this phantom document. It is a sprawling, meticulously maintained Mafia ledger. We are examining a massive web of illegal transfers from 1998 to 2002, funneling wealth directly to a top federal prosecutor. Banks was the invisible architect, washing dirty syndicate cash through legitimate political donors. He literally purchased a sitting prosecutor to assassinate 3 federal investigations into his operations. The sheer scale of this sociopathic corruption is absolutely sickening. It leaves us with an undeniable lesson. No matter how deeply a man buries his sins, arrogant greed will always leave a paper trail. Let us examine the pathology of this syndicate, you and I. Adrian dismantles Maeve's cognitive dissonance, forcing her to confront a grim reality. Her grandfather was no passive bystander in this criminal network. He functioned as the central nervous system for Vittorio Banks, processing the illicit finances that kept the megalomaniac narcissist in power. The old man's critical error occurred when he accessed the master ledger, mapping the complete psychological profile of this corruption. Every purchased politician and judge since 1991, we must remember a fundamental truth about human behavior. Here, when you willingly operate within the shadow of a true psychopath, you inevitably inherit the full, crushing weight of their deepest paranoias. We are analyzing a decade of institutional rot perfectly preserved in one document. The corrupt prosecutor kept it as insurance, but Maeve's grandfather excised it like a tumor. He memorized the data, duplicated the files, and brought this lethal diagnosis to Adrian's father. Adrian details the fallout with visible tension. His father knew instantly that Cassian Voss was marked for execution. A megalomaniac narcissist like Banks would scorch the earth to eliminate this threat. To shield his friend, Adrian's father fabricated a total erasure of Cassian's existence. Looking into the dead eyes of a boss and claiming the man was already a corpse, it reveals a complex human truth. Sometimes the deepest loyalty requires us to construct the most absolute, unforgivable lies. Although Banks internalized the deception, his clinical paranoia sustained a 22-year obsession. Adrian cuts the engine in a desolate parking structure, plunging them into a suffocating quiet. He maps out the behavioral baseline. Banks is experiencing acute psychological fragmentation, because his daughter's engagement was derailed by a waitress who harbors his darkest secrets. A narcissist knows nothing is random. Maeve remains paralyzed in the dark, her brain processing the traumatic stimuli of her new reality. Adrian observes her cognitive restructuring without interference, letting the silence stretch. It leaves us with a critical lesson. Interrupting someone while they are desperately rebuilding their psychological defenses always costs far more than it yields. Let us evaluate the parameters of this standoff. You and I, Maeve asserts that the syndicate boss remains blind to the ledger's physical existence. He only suspects her grandfather still draws breath. Adrian counters with a tone devoid of affect. He reminds her that a fraction of suspicion easily triggers a psychopath's violent impulses. For 22 years, this kingpin maintained his structure solely to repress this trauma. Now they have 20 minutes before Luca and his enforcers arrive to tear this sanctuary apart, driven by a twisted Stockholm syndrome that binds them to their captor's will. Here is the inescapable truth. Suppressing your darkest issues never cures them. It merely provides the quiet incubation they need to evolve into absolute monsters. The vehicle's confinement amplifies the pressure as Adrian issues a clinical ultimatum. He warns Maeve their survival window is closing, demanding the empirical data only her grandfather holds. Here, we witness a total behavioral shift. She sheds her civilian persona, revealing a subject drained by chronic trauma, having carried her family's pathological vendetta since childhood. When Adrian asks if she holds the evidence to dismantle the megalomaniac narcissist's empire, her expression hardens. She whispers her confirmation without a single autonomic flinch. We often mistake courage for the absence of fear. In reality, true courage is simply the complete exhaustion of the human flight response, leaving you absolutely no choice but to plant your feet and finally strike back. Under his interrogation, Maeve produces a dull brass key, holding it like a dense psychological anchor. And she admits to a hidden deposit box in Yonkers established by a ghost. Inside rests the ultimate behavioral deterrent, a digital drive and 2 pages her grandfather extracted from the ledger, containing enough power to bury a corrupt judge. This documentation presents a fatal diagnosis for the criminal enterprise. The clinical shock registers on Adrian's face when he learns this vault has remained sealed for 14 years. You and I must recognize the profound behavioral pattern at play here. The absolute most dangerous traumas we carry are almost always the ones we voluntarily lock away in the dark, foolishly convincing ourselves they no longer dictate the daily course of our lives. The history of this key exposes a generational cycle of systemic trauma. Her grandfather established that vault when she was merely 15, conditioning her with a grim psychological absolute. The contents would either save their bloodline or ensure their eradication. He programmed her with one inflexible boundary: she could never access it without a Vecco family member present. Processing this, Adrian sinks into a dissociative silence, the pathological legacy of his surname restricting his airway. Maeve clarifies she was simply waiting for the appropriate Vecco, recognizing him the moment his repressed grief nearly shattered Aha's composure. Trust is a massive psychological load to bear. True loyalty means enduring the agonizing weight of that trust until the optimal moment to act finally manifests. Maeve articulates the core anxiety dominating the space. Is he truly the correct Vecco? Adrian allows the silence to expand, refusing to offer superficial validation to regulate her nervous system. With a voice strained by unprocessed grief, he admits he may be the final Vecco surviving this pathological turf war. Before her brain can process the trauma of that statement, her phone illuminates the console. It is Felix, presenting with severe auditory tremors. Enforcers are converging on Manhattan Avenue, the exact coordinates of her grandfather's isolation zone. The psychological baseline plummets into acute panic. Existence rarely provides a controlled environment for finding yourself before exposing you to lethal stress. You must simply adapt to the flames and find a way to survive. Adrian adopts a tactical cognition, verifying if banks registered their departure. Felix introduces a disturbing anomaly. A third vehicle is present. Not a pursuit SUV, but a van maintaining stationary observation since midnight. Adrian's neural pathways connect the behavioral indicators. This is a targeted extraction protocol. He engages the transmission, jaw locked in physical tension. He theorizes the megalomaniac. Narcissist is deploying a familiar stimulus to draw the target out, weaponizing the old man's inherent trust. He looks at Maeve and verbalizes the trigger, Charlotte. It forces a brutal cognitive adjustment. The absolute most lethal psychological traps are never constructed by strangers. They are built by the familiar faces we instinctively leave our emotional boundaries open. 4. Maeve recoils, convinced Charlotte is a conscious participant in this design. Adrian clinically deconstructs the syndicate's pathology. A megalomaniac narcissist like Banks does not need his daughter's informed consent. He merely needs her emotional volatility to broadcast the grandfather's coordinates. He provided a loaded psychological trigger masquerading as a phone number, calculating her unmanaged anger would execute the sequence. On schedule, Adrian's device illuminates with Charlotte's identifier. Upon speaking, her regulated persona fragments into hysterical tremors, repeating that her father deceived her. Harboring unprocessed hostility simply renders you a susceptible instrument. It allows predators to directly weaponize your most agonizing traumas against you. We must examine this clinical fracture together, you and I, because Charlotte is experiencing a total collapse of her reality. Her primary caregiver admitted her marriage possessed zero emotional validity. It was exclusively a strategic maneuver to enforce dominance within his empire. She was never categorized as offspring. She was classified as a disposable asset. He supplied that encrypted number using gaslighting to promise clarity regarding the disruptions. Through the audio feed, her vocal patterns disintegrate as she confesses she nearly initiated that fatal communication. The psychological devastation here is absolute. The most agonizing paradigm shift a human can endure is recognizing that their primary protectors are actively negotiating the destruction of their emotional survival. Maeve exhibits catatonic stillness as Adrian deconstructs this megalomaniac's behavioral conditioning. He informs the hyperventilating Charlotte that her engagement was merely an environmental distractor. It was a psychological operation engineered to keep Adrian pursuing phantoms for 4 years. When Charlotte demands the rationale behind punishing a civilian, Adrian delivers a chilling clinical assessment. Maeve's behavioral record is immaculate. The inherited pathology stems exclusively from her grandfather, embedded within their corrupted generational lines. He issues a rigid directive forbidding Charlotte from activating that lethal number. We are frequently forced to settle toxic behavioral debts we never authorized, simply due to the unresolved trauma inherited from our predecessors. Let us examine this clinical fracture together. The silence on the line is absolute as Charlotte processes the ultimate betrayal by her primary caregiver. If she resists her role, the syndicate will violently sever her social attachments. Adrian, however, bypasses her trauma response, pivoting into an authoritarian command state. He issues rapid directives: secure the passport, destroy the phone, and evacuate to a Carroll Gardens safe house. When she exhibits a freeze response, asking what she is running from, Adrian administers a psychological shock. She is fleeing the inevitable pathology of her own father. We often see this in survival profiles. The profound lesson here is that sometimes you must amputate a deeply infected family bond just to ensure your own psychological survival. Adrian allows the psychological weight of his words to saturate the dead air. Charlotte utters a fractured sound of compliance, her defenses entirely dismantled. He terminates the call, finding Maeve observing him with acute cognitive dissonance. She notes the erratic profile of Charlotte, the woman who recently weaponized a glass object. Yet Adrian constructs her escape. But Adrian operates with cold tactical pragmatism. He calculates that isolating Charlotte deprives her father, a megalomaniac narcissist, of his primary proxy. It purchases the single variable they lack, which is time. True control is never about raw violence. It is about manipulating your adversary's pathological fixations to win the larger war. Adrian maintains a fixed forward stare, exhibiting intense emotional compartmentalization. He insists this extraction is devoid of any residual trauma bonding, framing the intervention purely as a clinical calculation that aligns with an ethical outcome. Maeve notes her grandfather would have validated such pragmatism, verbalizing a framework the older man instilled in her. Selecting the ethical route solely for secondary gain does not indicate a healthy conscience. It simply indicates a high-functioning opportunist. True structural integrity of the psyche is only proven when the moral choice demands a severe personal deficit. The ultimate psychological rupture does not occur in failure. But when you achieve your dark desires and completely collapse under their punishing gravity. You and I must analyze this baseline behavior as it triggers the primary trauma. Adrian speaks with a detached affect, confessing he managed this psychological load for 2 years. Maeve fixates on the jagged metal cutting her hand, an artifact anchoring 2 decades of hypervigilance. They accelerate toward Yonkers before Senator Banks processes the existence of this evidence. Banks pursued a delusion for 20 years, blind that the files were buried with a subject deceased in 1987. The clinical reality is that suppressed traumas always resurface with catastrophic volatility. If Banks secures the grandfather, he will employ systematic distress. Adrian simply demands the coordinates, while Maeve exhibits a physiological tremor in the shadows. Concealed in her bag is a fading visual stimulus. For 22 years, Maeve internalized the reputational destruction of a deceased relative, exhibiting chronic martyrdom. Now, she sits beside the biological offspring of the cartel leader who authorized that fatal contract. Maeve finally verbalizes the navigational data. It is a 41-minute drive directly into the nucleus of their intergenerational trauma. Adrian drives with the pathological tranquility of a subject who has already processed the destruction of his primary attachments. The behavioral lesson is absolute. Maintaining autonomic regulation during a crisis ensures survival, whereas impulsive dysregulation guarantees a fatal outcome. The urban decay transitions into suburban isolation, validating that psychological concealment is always a temporary state. You and I have likely observed the auditory void preceding a catastrophic escalation. The vehicle accelerates in silence, indicating physiological conservation of energy by traumatized subjects bracing for impact. Maeve's grandfather is concealed in Yonkers, monitored by George, who shared his combat trauma in 1968. George protected this lethal variable for 11 years without demanding a cognitive rationale. We extract a vital principle here. True protective bonding does not require verbalized justification. It simply neutralizes the threat. The network's architect, Felix, demonstrates the apex survival strategy. The most lethal subjects in any dynamic recognize that absolute invisibility remains the ultimate psychological weapon. Maeve initiates contact via the untraceable device. The vocal frequency of her caregiver fills the cabin as she reports their proximity, noting Adrian's presence. The older man states her father accurately predicted her behavioral trajectory. Maeve corrects this cognitive distortion, clarifying that environmental stressors forced her response. The clinical truth is unrelenting. We cannot curate the timeline of our most severe psychological conflicts. We must simply activate our dormant resilience when external threats breach our perimeter. The elderly subject experiences slight respiratory distress, questioning if Adrian replicates his father's dark pathology. observing Adrian's hypertonic grip on the steering column. Maeve validates the clinical diagnosis. Maeve hypothesizes that Adrian might exhibit a more functional adaptation than his predecessor. Her grandfather capitulates, relying on his 22 years of isolation trauma to sustain 40 more minutes. Maeve severs the connection. Adrian maintains intense visual focus, his jaw clenching as he acknowledges the dialogue. He highlights the cognitive dissonance of categorizing him as superior to a documented sociopath after a minimal observational window. Maeve remains effectively flat. Her grandfather conditioned her to perform rapid psychiatric profiling. There is an absolute law in predatory environments. Extended observation of a potential threat is a luxury. It is a privilege reserved exclusively for subjects who can endure the fatal consequences of an inaccurate assessment. Let us examine this diagnostic indicator together as it exposes a fundamental mechanism of human pathology. Maeve executes a precise psychological maneuver, revealing she conducted sustained surveillance on him for 11 months. Adrian absorbs this breach without displaying any autonomic arousal. Soon, his device vibrates with a text from Luca. When a syndicate enforcer downgrades from verbal to text communication, the data is highly volatile. Adrian transfers the acute panics. The interface indicates acute panic. Senator Banks is deteriorating into a state of hyper-arousal, frantically activating his legal proxies. The precise moment a megalomaniac begins soliciting external reinforcements. The psychological hierarchy has inverted. The apex predator has been reduced to prey. Maeve processes the digital data, experiencing immediate physiological distress. Banks did not compromise standard law enforcement. He activated a compromised deputy prosecutor. Luca's intelligence reveals a severe corruption model where Banks orchestrated the destruction of the official's predecessor. Adrian's vocal tone drops as the cognitive map solidifies. Banks maintains total proprietary control here. The politician is fabricating a legal inquiry to sequester authentic evidence within a classified institutional void. This functions as a profound clinical warning. The true destructive agent to societal equilibrium is rarely the dysregulated street offender. The apex pathogen is the polished sociopath who purchases the very instruments designed to measure objective reality. Adrian grips the steering wheel with extreme mechanical force. Banks accelerates his timeline because he is finally acute existential panic. We recognize this clinical endpoint. A cornered narcissist with unlimited assets is the most volatile variable in any psychological matrix. Survival anxiety bypasses logic, generating brutally efficient countermeasures. Adrian executes a violent turn with 3 minutes remaining, arriving at a street categorized by absolute environmental mediocrity. The location is a basic structure with degraded exterior elements. Her grandfather mastered the ultimate evasion protocol. To achieve total perceptual absence from hostile entities, you do not retreat into an isolated void. The most effective camouflage is complete immersion in the unremarkable baseline of everyday human existence. Maeve's vocal inflection hardens, demanding Adrian process the subject inside. This elderly man endured severe social deprivation, existing as a psychological phantom for 2 decades to secure one artifact. He is not a disposable variable, but the anchor allowing her to confront cartel leadership. She requires Adrian to treat him as a human, not an instrument for retaliation. Adrian establishes prolonged eye contact, projecting a nonverbal contract as the door opens. Inside, Cassian Voss maintains a dissociative posture while George provides silent security. We must acknowledge a profound clinical truth. It is highly efficient to instrumentalize traumatized individuals. But genuine psychological fortitude only manifests the moment you prioritize their fragile humanity over your own tactical objectives. Cassian presents at 81 years of age. His physiology manifests the brutal somatic toll of a 2-decade vendetta: ossified posture, tremors, epidermal scarring consistent with prolonged psychological combat. Yet, when his ocular focus locks onto Adrian, the presentation of frailty instantly disintegrates. We observe the piercing green gaze of an apex predator, identical in phenotype to Maeve. Adrian experiences acute paralytic shock in the doorway. He failed to predict this variable, a cognitive blind spot fatal in syndicate operations. The geriatric subject exudes a dominant psychological aura, an unyielding the biological drive. Time degrades the biological vessel, but a protector's pathological fixation on survival remains eternally virulent. Observe the environmental tension in this kitchen. Cassian exhibits the terrifying motor stillness of a trauma survivor who has outlasted his persecutors. He wields silence as a psychological weapon, a suffocating void that instantly triggers Adrian's repressed paternal trauma. As Adrian sits across from this living, Cassian verbalizes his assessment. His vocal tone is unyielding. He clinically notes that Adrian possesses his mother's facial symmetry, but retains his father's dead, calculating ocular effect. Adrian suppresses an acute emotional spike, quietly affirming the diagnosis. We are inescapably tethered to our primary caregivers, forever projecting the traumatic legacies of our lineage through our own biological reflections. Cassian intentionally fractures the silence with a paradigm-shifting revelation, contradicting the established psychopathy of Adrian's father. Cassian categorizes the man as highly principled. The deceased patriarch engineered a 22-year concealment strategy for Cassian's bloodline, demanding zero reciprocal favors. Cassian suddenly exhibits unregulated affect, weeping openly while expressing remorse for his absence at the funeral. Adrian experiences severe emotional constriction, whispering a defense of his father's logic. Cassian then shifts focus to Maeve, validating her flawless execution of the survival protocol. Examine this case file closely, you and I. Genuine allegiance operates beneath the threshold of observation. The most profound psychological anchors we leave behind are the silent sacrifices that no one could ever adequately reciprocate. Let us clinically dissect this behavioral frame. Cassian displays a brief positive affect, acknowledging Maeve's rigid adherence to his operative directives. He posits a classic criminological theory: subjects bound to inflexible routines become easily predictable, rendering Adrian's father a doomed variable. Adrian processes the trauma of this statement, but his survival mechanisms override the grief. He shifts into a state of hyperarousal, warning that Banks mobilized a corrupt prosecutor exactly 40 minutes prior. Their operational window is collapsing. Astonishingly, Cassian exhibits total autonomic regulation. He is a man who has integrated the inevitability of his own termination. A mind only achieves true equilibrium when it stops fleeing its cognitive dissonance and actively embraces its fatalistic reality. The ambient temperature of the interaction plummets. Adrian adopts an aggressive forward posture, interrogating Cassian for empirical data regarding the concealed documentation. He requires the lethal variables kept hidden from Maeve. Cassian emits a labored sigh, confessing to intentional omission. Maeve's facial micro-expressions register acute betrayal trauma. Cassian offers a fragile vocalization of regret, citing his psychological need to insulate her from the catastrophic burden of full situational awareness. Establishing a dominant visual lock with Adrian, Cassian diagnoses the underlying mechanism. Arthur Greer weaponized the file as a deterrent against the syndicate. The most destructive cognitive loads we carry are the toxic truths we compartmentalize to preserve the psychological integrity of our dependents. Cassian introduces a data point that radically destabilizes their current behavioral paradigm. Prior to his death in 2019, Arthur Greer executed a posthumous contingency plan. He routed a secure parcel to a Philadelphia legal firm containing a key to compromising archival data from 2001, explicitly designated for Adrian. Adrian perfectly maintains his sociopathic mask, presenting zero affect. However, the blanching of his knuckles betrays profound internal dysregulation. This physiological leakage illustrates a fundamental psychiatric principle. Repressed historical trauma is never truly neutralized. It merely incubates in the dark, awaiting the precise stimulus to breach the surface. Adrian reasserts cognitive control, inquiring if Greer deliberately profiled him. Cassian negates this hypothesis. Greer operated purely on the behavioral mythology of Adrian's predecessor. The contingency was designed for whichever alpha predator inherited the syndicate structure, assuming they would inherently understand how to deploy the weapon. Cassian details how the legal associates maintained a holding pattern for 6 years, calculating that a direct transfer would initiate a violence cascade. The manifestation of this responsibility visibly compresses Adrian's posture. We see this pathology across generations. Genuine inheritance is rarely a transfer of assets. It is the forced psychological integration of the unresolved conflicts and blood-stained ledgers left by broken men. Adrian processes the nomenclature of the legal firm. The cognitive dissonance forces him to physically strike the table. He contracted these exact practitioners in 2021 for benign operations. Cassian validates the pathological irony. These individuals maintained close proximity while actively withholding his operational destiny. Greer mandated a behavioral stress test, requiring them to passively observe the young heir until he demonstrated the sociopathic traits necessary to manage his father's violent infrastructure. Adrian enters a state of mute, internalized rage. The diagnostic takeaway is profound. The most critical evaluations of our baseline character do not occur under extreme duress, but in the sterile, unmonitored vacuums of daily routine. Cassian clinically identifies this exact temporal intersection as the catalyst they anticipated. Adrian requires a mere 4 seconds of cognitive processing in time. By the 5th second, his profile shifts into an active predatory state. He initiates a cellular connection, his vocal modulation dropping to absolute zero. He bypasses protocols, demanding the executor of the Greer estate, demonstrating total awareness of the 2019 contingency. The auditory feed registers a suffocating void. 45 seconds of psychological warfare elapse before Philip Calloway responds, his vocal tremors indicating a total collapse of his stress coping mechanisms. Let us document this therapeutic reality. When situational paralysis infects your environment, the only viable countermeasure is unapologetic forward aggression. Exhibiting acute distress, Calloway admits his predictive models failed to anticipate this contact. Adrian clinically confirms the accelerated timeline, acquiescing to the dominance. Calloway catalogs the concealed ammunition, 37 forensic reports, 11 admissions of guilt, and 4 folios proving Senator Banks absorbed illicit finances in the 1990s. It is a flawlessly engineered trap. However, Calloway introduces an uncontrolled variable. A compromised deputy initiated COT 40 minutes prior, actively probing for the archives. The systemic stability is cascading into terminal entropy. This serves as a predictable behavioral constant. When the psychological dam of repressed secrets finally sustains structural failure, the resulting trauma always inundates the subject from every conceivable vector. Adrian's autonomic arousal peaks, his vocal tone fracturing the space as he interrogates the lawyer's disclosures to the deputy. Calloway stammers, relying on the fragile shield of legal privilege, noting the deputy threatened a judicially authorized raid. Adrian assesses his cohabitants. Cassian remains catatonic in his grief processing, while Maeve exhibits textbook paralytic terror. In a masterful display of manipulation, Adrian reclaims absolute control. He instructs the attorney to circumnavigate municipal law enforcement and interface directly with the Federal Bureau of Investigation in New York within 30 minutes to assert obstruction of justice. Rexporian 5. The behavioral lesson is undeniable. When confined within a pathologically rigged operational framework, compliance is a death sentence. One must completely invert the power dynamic to survive. The attorney exhibits respiratory distress, classifying federal intervention as a catastrophe of a primary psychopath. Adrian verbally severs the protest. He states Arthur Greer gambled on his genetic predisposition for violence, and his lineage honors its obligations. The environment regresses into an oppressive silence, fractured only by the cognitive dissonance of a morning broadcast. Maeve vocalizes her anxiety, projecting a 1-hour timeline before Banks uncovers the maneuver. Adrian is already transmitting directives to Luca, calculating a 50-minute window before retaliatory assets arrive. Stay with me as we evaluate this, you and I. The most catastrophic systemic conflicts are not initiated on battlefields, but quietly engineered within the unassuming confines of a domestic living space. Let us examine this clinical tableau. Adrian fixates on Cassian, exhibiting the hypervigilance of a subject trapped in a hostile environment. Observe Cassian's response. A slow, exhausted smile materializes on his weathered face. It is the distinct physiological reaction of an aging predator who has operated in the shadows for decades, finally witnessing his trap engage. He suggests a remote relative in Connecticut, offering to extract Maeve. But Adrian severs the tension with a definitive refusal, striking the room with the finality of a gavel. Today, you and I are going to unpack this story together. We recognize this specific behavioral pivot. It is the precise microsecond a subject ceases their flight response, anchors themselves in the reality of their trauma, and finally pivots to confront the pathology hunting them. Adrian dictates that Maeve will remain with him, introducing a radical variable into their dynamic. Clinically speaking, he is weaponizing his own presence, offering himself as a stimulus to fixate Senator Banks's attention. He requires the target's cognitive bandwidth fully engaged, while federal operatives dismantle his infrastructure. The stark lighting accentuates Adrian's hollowed effect as he denies being the primary threat. He suffers from a profound cognitive distortion, viewing himself merely as a shadow of power, mirroring his late father. Cassian diagnoses this tragic mirroring instantly, noting the father harbored the exact same delusion. The psychological takeaway here is stark. Often, subjects who perceive themselves as peripheral entities are actually the structural keystones keeping their entire chaotic environment intact. Cassian shifts forward, his posture burdened by the somatic memory of countless violent conflicts. He delivers a crucial diagnostic truth. A subject willing to sacrifice operational dominance to shield something authentic does not merely orbit authority. They embody it. Striking the table, Cassian displays a sudden surge of neurological resilience. He exposes the foundational trauma, stating Adrian's father forged a fatal pact and Adrian has blindly serviced this pathological debt. The gravity of this inherited trauma impacts Adrian visibly. We observe him gently anchor his hand over Cassian's trembling fingers. Observing from the periphery, Maeve experiences a notable decrease in physiological distress. The clinical reality is undeniable. Authentic attachment does not expire with the biological organism. It simply rewires the behavioral pathways of the next generation. Let us look at this piece by piece, shall we? The psychological density in this space is easily quantifiable. Maeve remains locked in suppressed respiration, still reacting to the conditioning inflicted by Banks. Yet, we detect a micro-expression of relief as she unburdens herself of a repressed narrative. You and I know how untreated trauma metabolizes, how chronic secrecy degrades a subject's cognitive framework. But this stabilization is abruptly terminated. The jarring auditory stimulus of her phone triggers an immediate orienting response. A dispatch from Felix indicates a transport vehicle is traversing the Manhattan Bridge. Adrian shifts into high alert. Banks is recalling his enforcers, a definitive indicator of systemic panic. The infrastructure of his control is rapidly destabilizing. Methodically, Adrian realigns his focus, locking his clinical stare onto Maeve. The tension escalates as Adrian isolates a critical temporal vulnerability in the senator's retreat. Maeve reorients toward her grandfather. Cassian presents as a severely depleted organism, his physical deterioration reflecting 2 decades of sustained trauma. He produces a brittle rasp, pleading for the termination of this generational violence. Maeve verbally commits to future contact. Displaying advanced motor degradation, Cassian elevates his trembling hand to touch her face. He verbalizes a profound guilt complex, stating her moral baseline far exceeds what his history merits. He attempts to speak of her father, but acute emotional dysregulation overrides his speech center. The clinical lesson is essential. True adaptation requires recognizing when our operational capacity has expired, allowing uncompromised subjects to finally conclude the sequence. Stick with me here, because this is where the psychological variables rapidly compound. Cassian forcefully suppresses his acute emotional distress, manually regulating his respiration. He reinforces Maeve's self-esteem, stating her father would approve of her trajectory. She initiates brief tactile contact, then triggers her flight response, exiting into the severe morning climate with Adrian mirroring her movements. Inside, George maintains proximity to his deteriorating associate using nonverbal grounding techniques. This demonstrates that optimal psychological support often relies entirely on proximity rather than verbalization. Externally, the auditory environment ruptures. Adrian engages a localized 212 area code. A highly regulated voice identifies as Special Agent Diana Rice. The deferred consequences of their historical pathology are finally demanding immediate processing. Agent Rice vocalizes with the severe, affective, flattening typical of high-stress operatives, identifying Adrian as the missing link in their investigation. Adrian mirrors her clinical detachment, confirming his role as the primary system architect. She mandates their physical presence at Federal Plaza within 60 minutes, a parameter he accepts without hesitation. Terminating the connection, the low-lux morning illumination highlights the environmental frost. The reality of their impending systemic collapse serves as a psychological anchor. He cautions Maeve that their offensive strike must be absolute. Banks uses vast financial resources as a maladaptive defense mechanism. Adrian assesses her state, questioning if her internal framework can withstand the trauma. The clinical takeaway is immutable. Eradicating an entrenched pathological system inevitably requires incinerating your own psychological safety mechanisms in the process. Observe Maeve's active suppression of her autonomic nervous system. She strictly prohibits her mandible from trembling. She catalogs her family's somatic destruction, a grandfather's prolonged psychogenic paralysis, and a mother's terminal loss of identity. We deduce a severe behavioral law here. Relying on avoidance strategies against historical abuse merely guarantees the pathology will consume your future. Her vocal modulation presents a detached resonance requiring immense cognitive taxation to sustain. She aims to surgically excise the origin of a generational trauma loop. Adrian internalizes this resilience. 40 minutes into transit, the silence fractures. Here we examine Luca. Presenting classic indicators of Stockholm Syndrome, his fractured loyalty is evident as he relays critical data. The megalomaniac's defenses are failing. Senator Banks is hemorrhaging public viability as his legal apparatus disintegrates. Luca's call confirms Charlotte is secured within Rosa's domestic perimeter. Analyzing Rosa's behavioral profile, we see a highly resilient containment vessel. She metabolizes extreme environmental stressors with regulated efficiency, processing profound systemic violence without external dysregulation. Luca, deeply entangled in his trauma bond, is cognitively destabilized by her unconditioned loyalty. 50 minutes into their trajectory, a catastrophic structural failure occurs. The United States Attorney terminates his position, a primary indicator of systemic collapse. Charlotte transmits a concise text asserting Adrian's predictive accuracy. Adrian exhibits high impulse control, leaving the device inactive. Upon arrival at Federal Plaza, Agent Rice maintains complete kinetic stillness. She exhibits the physiological baseline of an apex predator. Against a rapidly destabilizing subject, the most devastating psychological countermeasure is absolute, static patience. The interrogation environment is aggressively illuminated, designed to induce sensory fatigue. Agent Rice executes a rapid ocular assessment of Adrian, categorizing his psychological state, before applying the same clinical scrutiny to Maeve. Experiencing a minor motor tremor, Maeve deposits a metal key. The acoustic impact against the mahogany table acts as a focal trigger. Rice analyzes the artifact with a neutralized affect, identifying a specific secure storage unit in Yonkers. Maeve provides affirmative, nonverbal feedback. This container archives the data matrix of the megalomaniac's operations, including Cassian's documented admission of systemic corruption. Her vocal control fractures as she dates the manuscript to 2018. You and I must recognize the fundamental mechanism here. The unadulterated, objective data set is the singular catalyst necessary to permanently destabilize an architecture built on cognitive dissonance. Maeve's vocalization indicates severe emotional exhaustion. She articulates the parameters of Cassian's condition. A 4-year psychogenic paralysis maintained by the knowledge that verbalizing the truth would terminate his genetic line. Rice evaluates the physical markers of chronic hypervigilance on Maeve's face, inquiring about the duration of this psychological burden. Maeve undergoes a brief dissociative flashback, processing intrusive visual memories of suppressed trauma. Re-engaging with the agent's frigid gaze, she reports the duration encompasses her entire lifespan. Rice provides a singular affirmative nod. She employs zero palliative reassurances. This illustrates a vital clinical boundary. Superficial empathy is utterly useless for subjects drowning in pathological systems. Only precise, methodical intervention offers genuine extraction. Uncapping her implement, Rice prepares to surgically excise the necrotic tissue. Rice issues a directive to commence, and the foundational architecture of the narcissistic supply chain instantly fractures. We advance the timeline 180 minutes. Federal operatives physically extract Senator Banks from his primary residence. The documentation authorizing this intrusion is so legally impenetrable that his defense counsel immediately exhibits avoidant behavior. Banks offers zero verbal resistance. Thrust into the highly stimulating external environment, the curated social persona he maintained for 4 decades completely disintegrates. Stick with me, because this phase is a masterclass in behavioral pathology. A subject operating with a clear conscience actively resists sudden detainment. Conversely, Banks's face registers absolute vacuity. The diagnostic truth is inescapable. A chronic manipulator, suffocated by repressed moral injury, reliably defaults to a catatonic freeze, response the exact microsecond his grandiose delusion is structurally invalidated. Let us examine this final response. Charlotte sits motionless in Rosa's armchair, bathed in the glow of a television. The scent of simmering tomatoes offers a domestic warmth that contradicts the breaking news detailing the ruin of her bloodline. What we are witnessing is not grief. It is profound, suffocating psychological paralysis. She is processing the crushing realization that her childhood was financed by human suffering. Rosa does not offer useless verbal platitudes. She simply sets down a steaming porcelain cup, letting the toxic shadows of their shared trauma finally dissipate. If we take one lesson from this case, it is this: standing on the agonizing truth is vastly superior to suffocating in a beautifully engineered deception.